The glittering diamond ring caught the last rays of the setting Atlanta sun, its brilliance a stark contrast to the darkness that would soon engulf two lives forever. Linda Williams, 28, stood frozen, her trembling hand outstretched as John Steve, 32, slipped the ring onto her finger. Their eyes met, a moment of pure joy that would, in just 24 hours, transform into unimaginable horror. "Yes, John, 1,000 times yes," Linda's voice rang out, echoing through Centennial Olympic Park. Onlookers cheered, captured by the romance of the moment. Little did they know they were witnessing the beginning of a tragedy that would shock the entire city of Atlanta and beyond. As the newly engaged couple embraced, their silhouettes merging against the backdrop of the city's skyline, no one could have predicted the sinister turn their love story was about to take. For in just one day, this scene of celebration would be replaced by one of violence, betrayal, and irreversible consequences. This is the story of Linda Williams and John Steve, a tale of love corroded by jealousy, trust shattered by deceit, and a future destroyed in the blink of an eye. It's a cautionary narrative that proves that sometimes the line between love and hate is thinner than we'd like to believe, and that the most damaging wounds can be inflicted by those closest to our hearts. Linda Williams and John Steve seemed like the epitome of a perfect couple to anyone who knew them in Atlanta's vibrant Midtown neighborhood. Their love story had all the makings of a modern-day fairy tale, beginning 5 years ago when they first locked eyes across the crowded dance floor of Tongue and Groove, one of Atlanta's hottest nightclubs. Linda, a vivacious marketing executive with a megawatt smile and an infectious laugh, had been celebrating her latest promotion with a group of girlfriends. John, a charismatic software engineer with boyish charm and ambitious dreams, was out with his coworkers, unwinding after a grueling product launch. Their initial encounter was nothing short of electric. As the pulsating beats of hip-hop and R&B filled the air, John made his way through the sea of bodies, drawn to Linda like a moth to a flame. Their eyes met, and in that instant, both felt a connection that transcended the superficial nature of a typical club meeting. "Can I buy you a drink?" John had to shout over the music, his warm brown eyes twinkling with interest. Linda, usually cautious with strangers, found herself inexplicably at ease. "Only if you promise to show me your best dance moves after," she challenged, her smile a mix of flirtation and genuine curiosity. That night marked the beginning of what many would call a whirlwind romance. John and Linda discovered they had an uncanny amount in common. Both were children of hard-working African-American families who had instilled in them the values of education, perseverance, and ambition. They shared a love for Atlanta's rich cultural scene, from the soulful sounds of its music venues to the mouth-watering delights of its diverse culinary landscape. Their relationship blossomed quickly, nurtured by shared interests and complementary personalities. Linda's outgoing nature and creative flair perfectly balanced John's more analytical mindset and quiet determination. They pushed each other to grow, celebrating each other's successes and providing unwavering support during challenging times. To their friends, family, and colleagues, Linda and John were hashed relationship goals personified. Their social media feeds were a carefully curated showcase of their seemingly perfect life together. Romantic getaways to the Georgia coast, cozy nights in their stylish Midtown apartment, and glamorous date nights at Atlanta's trendiest restaurants. "Y'all make me believe in love again," Linda's best friend Tasha often joked, only half kidding. The sentiment was echoed by many in their circle, who looked to Linda and John as proof that true love still existed in the fast-paced, often cynical modern world. But as with many things in life, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the veneer of their picture-perfect relationship, cracks had begun to form, hairline fractures that would eventually threaten to shatter the very foundation of their love. The first signs of trouble appeared about 3 years into their relationship. John, always ambitious, had thrown himself into a new startup venture, pouring countless hours into building his dream of creating the next big tech innovation. His dedication was admirable, but it came at a cost: time with Linda. Linda, while supportive of John's aspirations, found herself increasingly lonely. The romantic dinners became less frequent, replaced by quick takeout meals eaten while John hunched over his laptop. Their weekend adventures exploring Atlanta's hidden gems dwindled, with John often begging off to work on his project. "It's just for a little while, baby," John would assure her, planting a distracted kiss on her forehead. "Once we secure this round of funding, things will calm down. I promise." But weeks turned into months, and Linda found herself grappling with a growing sense of neglect. She threw herself into her own work, climbing the corporate ladder with a fervor that matched John's entrepreneurial zeal. On the surface, they were still the power couple everyone admired, but behind closed doors, a distance was growing between them. It was during this time that Linda reconnected with an old college flame, Marcus. What started as innocent catch-up coffee meetings slowly evolved into something more complicated. Marcus provided the attention and affection that Linda found lacking in her relationship with John. She justified their increasing closeness as harmless friendship, but deep down, she knew she was treading dangerous waters. John, consumed by his work, remained oblivious to the changes in Linda. He mistook her newfound independence for personal growth. Proud of her professional achievements, but unaware of the emotional void he had left unfilled. As their 5th anniversary approached, John finally realized the toll his single-minded focus had taken on their relationship. Determined to make amends and recommit to their love, he began planning an elaborate proposal. He wanted to prove to Linda that she was, and always would be, his top priority. Little did John know that his grand gesture would set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter both their lives. The proposal, meant to be a new beginning, would instead mark the beginning of the end. A tragic countdown to a moment of violence that would leave both of them scarred, literally and figuratively. The stage was set for a collision of love, betrayal, and unfathomable consequences. In just 24 hours, the couple that everyone envied would become the subject of shocked whispers and sensational headlines. The perfect love story was about to take a dark, twisted turn that no one could have anticipated. The day of John's proposal dawned bright and clear, a perfect Atlanta spring morning. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of blooming dogwood trees that lined the city streets. John woke early, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Today was the day he would ask Linda to be his wife, to commit to forever with him. He had spent weeks meticulously planning every detail of the proposal. It would start with breakfast at the Flying Biscuit Cafe, Linda's favorite spot for Southern comfort food. Then, a romantic walk through Piedmont Park, where they had shared countless picnics and lazy Sunday afternoons. The main event would take place at sunset in Centennial Olympic Park, with the dancing fountains and the Atlanta skyline as their backdrop. As John went about his morning routine, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought about the rough patches they'd weathered, particularly in the past year when his startup had consumed so much of his time and energy. A pang of guilt shot through him as he remembered the nights he'd come home to find Linda already asleep, or the weekends he'd spent hunched over his computer instead of exploring the city with her. "Today changes everything," he murmured to himself, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "I'm going to make it all up to her." Across town, Linda was also awake early, but for different reasons. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone, her thumb hovering over Marcus's name in her contact list. They had plans to meet for coffee later that day, a standing date that had become a fixture in her weekly routine. But something felt different today. The guilt that usually simmered just beneath the surface was bubbling up, threatening to overflow. Linda thought about John, about the life they had built together. She remembered the early days of their relationship, how John's smile could light up a room, how his touch could make her feel like the only woman in the world. When had things changed? When had she started looking elsewhere for the affection and attention she craved? With a heavy sigh, Linda typed out a message to Marcus. "Can't make it today. Something came up." She hit send before she could change her mind. It was time to refocus on her relationship with John, to give him another chance. They had been through too much together to throw it all away. As Linda got ready for the day, she had no idea that John was about to make a grand gesture that would force her to confront her feelings head-on. The day unfolded just as John had planned. Breakfast at the Flying Biscuit was filled with laughter and easy conversation, reminiscent of their early dating days. Linda found herself relaxing, enjoying John's company in a way she hadn't for months. As they strolled through Piedmont Park, hand in hand, she felt a rekindling of the spark that had first drawn them together. "You seem different today," Linda remarked as they paused to watch a group of children flying kites on the meadow. "More present, I guess." John squeezed her hand, his eyes serious. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about us, about our future. I know I haven't been the best boyfriend this past year, but I want you to know that you're the most important thing in my life, Linda. Nothing else comes close." Linda felt a lump form in her throat. The sincerity in John's voice was unmistakable, and it made her heart ache with a mixture of love and guilt. She thought about Marcus, about the line she had been so close to crossing. In that moment, she made a silent vow to recommit herself to John, to the love they shared. As the sun began to set, John led Linda to Centennial Olympic Park. The fountains danced in the fading light, creating a magical atmosphere. Families and couples milled about, enjoying the warm evening, but to John and Linda, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. John guided Linda to a spot near the fountains, his hands trembling slightly as he took both of hers in his. "Linda," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "these past 5 years with you have been the best of my life. You've been my rock, my inspiration, my best friend. I know I haven't always shown it, but you mean everything to me." Linda's eyes widened as John slowly lowered himself to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I promise to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much I love you, how much I cherish you. Linda Williams, will you marry me?" The world seemed to stand still as John opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring. Linda gasped, tears welling up in her eyes. In that moment, all her doubts, all her conflicted feelings about Marcus seemed to evaporate. This was John, her John, the man she had built a life with, the man she had dreamed of marrying. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, John, 1,000 times yes!" The park erupted in applause as John slipped the ring onto Linda's finger and stood to embrace her. They kissed passionately, oblivious to the crowd that had gathered to witness their special moment. As they broke apart, both laughing and crying, Linda felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was where she belonged, with John. She silently reaffirmed her earlier vow, promising herself that she would end things with Marcus for good, that she would devote herself fully to building a life with John. Little did Linda know that her past actions would come back to haunt her, setting in motion a chain of events that would shatter their newfound happiness in less than 24 hours. The ring on her finger, symbol of their love and commitment, would soon become a painful reminder of what could have been, of a future destroyed by secrets, jealousy, and one moment of uncontrollable rage. As John and Linda left the park, hand in hand, glowing with happiness, they were blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing, ready to tear their world apart. The countdown to tragedy had begun, ticking away the precious hours of their engagement, leading inexorably towards a moment of violence that would change their lives forever. The evening air was electric with excitement as John and Linda made their way to Echo, an upscale European restaurant in Midtown Atlanta. John had made reservations weeks in advance, wanting everything to be perfect for their engagement celebration. As they entered the dimly lit space, the warm glow of candles and the soft clink of glasses created an atmosphere of intimacy and romance. "To us," John said, raising his glass of champagne once they were seated. His eyes sparkled with joy and love as he gazed at Linda across the table. "To our future together." Linda smiled, clinking her glass against his. "To us," she echoed, pushing down the small voice of guilt that threatened to surface. She was determined to focus on this moment, on the man she had just promised to spend her life with. As they savored the exquisite meal, pan-seared scallops, truffle risotto, and a decadent chocolate dessert, they talked about their future. John spoke animatedly about his visions for their life together. A beautiful home in the suburbs, a couple of kids running around in the backyard, family vacations to exotic locations. "I was thinking we could get married next spring," John said, reaching across the table to take Linda's hand. "Maybe have the ceremony at the Atlanta Botanical Garden? You've always loved the Orchid Center there. Linda nodded, her throat tight with emotion. That sounds perfect, John. Absolutely perfect. And in that moment, she meant it. The love she felt for John was overwhelming, pushing all thoughts of Marcus to the furthest corners of her mind. As the night wore on, Linda found herself relaxing, genuinely enjoying John's company in a way she hadn't for months. His smile, his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was truly happy, all the little things that had made her fall in love with him in the first place came rushing back. But even as she basked in the glow of their engagement, a nagging worry persisted at the back of her mind. She knew she had to end things with Marcus, cleanly and definitively. The thought of it filled her with a mixture of dread and resolve. As they left the restaurant, arm in arm, Linda's phone buzzed in her purse. She ignored it, focusing instead on the feel of John's arm around her waist, the sound of his voice as he hailed a cab to take them home. It wasn't until much later, when John had fallen asleep, that Linda finally checked her phone. Her heart sank as she saw 3 missed calls and a text message from Marcus. Hey, missed you today? Everything okay? Can we meet tomorrow? There's something important I need to talk to you about. Linda stared at the message, her earlier resolve wavering. What could be so important? Despite her best intentions, curiosity got the better of her. She typed out a quick reply. Hey, usual place, 10 a.m. As soon as she hit send, regret washed over her. She shouldn't be meeting Marcus at all, let alone behind John's back. But it would be the last time. She promised herself. She would end things once and for all, explain that she was engaged now, and that whatever had been developing between them had to stop. With that decision made, Linda curled up next to John, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. She held up her left hand, admiring the way her engagement ring caught the faint light filtering through the curtains. This was her future, right here. Nothing and no one would jeopardize that. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, as if the weather itself was foreshadowing the tumultuous events to come. Linda woke early, carefully extricating herself from John's embrace. She left a note on the kitchen counter. Gone for a quick run and coffee with Tasha. Back soon. Love you. Before slipping out of the apartment. The guilt she felt at the lie was almost overwhelming, but Linda pushed it down. This was the last time, she reminded herself. After today, there would be no more secrets between her and John. She arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes before 10, her stomach churning with nerves. Marcus was already there, sitting at a table in the corner, 2 steaming cups in front of him. Linda, he said, standing as she approached. His smile faltered as he noticed the ring on her left hand. You're engaged? Linda nodded, sitting down across from him. Yes, John proposed yesterday. That's actually why I'm here, Marcus. Whatever this is between us, it has to stop. I love John. I'm going to marry him. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, intense. I was going to ask you to leave him for me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Linda felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her feet. Marcus, I love you, Linda, Marcus continued, reaching across the table to grasp her hand. I think you love me too. You can't marry John, not when you have feelings for someone else. Linda pulled her hand away, her mind reeling. I don't. It's not like that, Marcus. What we had, it was a mistake. I was feeling neglected, and you were there, but it doesn't change how I feel about John. So all those times you told me you were unhappy with him, all those moments we shared, they meant nothing? Marcus's voice had risen, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. Please keep your voice down, Linda hissed, looking around nervously. I'm sorry if I led you on, Marcus. That was never my intention. But I'm with John. I'm going to marry him. That's not going to change. She stood, grabbing her purse. I'm sorry, but this is goodbye. Please don't contact me again. As Linda hurried out of the coffee shop, she didn't notice the man sitting a few tables away, his face hidden behind a newspaper. She didn't see him lower the paper, revealing a face twisted with shock and anger. She didn't realize that John, suspicious after finding her hastily scribbled note, had followed her. And she certainly couldn't have predicted the devastating chain of events that her meeting with Marcus had set in motion. In just a few short hours, the life she had so carefully planned would come crashing down around her, destroyed by jealousy, betrayal, and one unforgivable act of violence. The clock was ticking, counting down to a moment that would change everything. And Linda, hurrying home with the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, had no idea that she was walking straight into the eye of the storm. John sat in his car, parked a block away from their apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The scene he had witnessed at the coffee shop played on repeat in his mind, each replay stoking the fires of his anger and betrayal. He had suspected something was off with Linda for a while now. The late nights at work, the secretive text messages, the way she sometimes seemed distant, even when they were together. But he had pushed those doubts aside, convinced that their love was strong enough to weather any storm. Now, faced with the irrefutable evidence of her deception, John felt as if his entire world was crumbling around him. With a deep breath, John stepped out of the car and made his way to their apartment. He needed answers. He needed to hear it from Linda herself. Maybe there was an explanation, some reason that could make sense of what he had seen. As he entered the apartment, he found Linda in the kitchen, busying herself with making lunch. She looked up as he came in, a smile on her face that quickly faded when she saw his expression. "John? What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern and a hint of fear. John stood there for a moment, struggling to find the words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, barely containing the storm of emotions raging within him. "I saw you, Linda. At the coffee shop. With him." The color drained from Linda's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken accusations. "How long?" John finally asked, his voice cracking. "How long have you been seeing him behind my back?" Linda's mind raced, searching for the right words to explain, to make John understand. "It's not what you think, John. Marcus and I, it's complicated, but it's not what you're imagining." "Complicated?" John's voice rose, his carefully maintained control slipping. "What's so complicated about betraying the person you claim to love? What's so complicated about lying to my face day after day?" Tears welled up in Linda's eyes. "I never meant to hurt you, John. It happened. I was feeling lonely, and Marcus was there, and what? You thought it was okay to throw away 5 years of our life together?" John's voice was bitter, laced with pain and anger. "Was I not enough for you, Linda? Was our love not enough?" Linda moved towards him, reaching out to touch his arm. "John, please, let me explain. I love you. What happened with Marcus was a mistake. It didn't mean anything." John jerked away from her touch as if it burned him. "Didn't mean anything?" "I heard you, Linda. I heard you tell him that you were unhappy with me. I saw the way you looked at him. Don't stand there and lie to me again." The hurt in John's eyes was almost more than Linda could bear. She felt as if she were drowning in guilt and regret. "I'm sorry, John. I'm so sorry. But I chose you. I said yes when you proposed. I want to be with you, only you. How can I believe anything you say?" John's voice was barely above a whisper now, filled with a pain that cut Linda to her core. "How can I trust you after this?" Linda's tears were flowing freely now. "Please, John, give me another chance. I'll do anything to make this right. I love you. I want to marry you. What I had with Marcus, it's over. It was a mistake, and I've ended it." John stood there, silent, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He wanted to believe her, desperately to go back to the happiness they had shared just yesterday. But the image of Linda with Marcus, the sound of her voice as she spoke to him, kept intruding. "I need some air," he finally said, turning towards the door. I can't look at you right now." "John, wait!" Linda called after him, but he was already gone, the door slamming behind him with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. Left alone in the suddenly too quiet apartment, Linda sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Just yesterday, she had been on top of the world, newly engaged and looking forward to a future with the man she loved. Now it felt as if that future was slipping away, destroyed by her own actions. As the hours ticked by, Linda alternated between pacing the apartment and sitting by the phone, willing it to ring. She sent text after text to John, each one more desperate than the last, but received no response. The silence was deafening, filling her with a growing sense of dread. What Linda didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that across town, John was spiraling into a dark place. Fueled by alcohol and a toxic mix of love, hate, and betrayal, he was making a decision that would alter both their lives forever. In his pain-addled mind, a plan was forming, a plan born of hurt and revenge, a plan that would lead to unimaginable consequences. The clock continued its relentless march forward, counting down the hours, minutes, and seconds to a moment of violence that would shatter their world. And Linda, alone in their apartment, surrounded by the remnants of their once happy life, had no idea of the danger that was heading her way. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave both of them scarred, literally and figuratively. In just a few short hours, the love story that had seemed so perfect would come to a shocking, tragic end. And Atlanta would wake up to a news story that would send shockwaves through the community, leaving everyone wondering how love could turn so quickly to hate, and how a moment of passion could lead to such a horrific act of violence. As the sun began to set over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the city, John found himself in a seedy bar on the outskirts of town. The establishment was a far cry from the upscale lounges he usually frequented with Linda. Here the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of spilled beer. It suited his mood perfectly. John nursed his fourth, or was it fifth, whiskey, his mind a chaotic swirl of memories and emotions. He thought about the first time he met Linda, how her smile had lit up the room. He remembered their first kiss, their first "I love you," the countless moments of joy and laughter they had shared. But each happy memory was now tainted, overshadowed by the image of Linda with Marcus. Women. The grizzled man next to him at the bar grunted, noticing John's dejected expression. They'll break your heart every time. John looked up, meeting the stranger's bloodshot eyes. You have no idea, he muttered, downing the rest of his drink in one burning gulp. Oh, I've been there, buddy, the man said, signaling the bartender for another round. Let me guess, she cheated on you? John nodded, accepting the fresh drink with a mumbled thanks. Engaged yesterday, found out she was seeing someone else today. How's that for timing? The stranger let out a low whistle. That's rough, man. But you know what? You can't let her get away with that. You gotta show her she can't treat you like that. Something in the man's words resonated with the anger simmering just beneath John's grief. Yeah? And how do I do that? The stranger leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I know a guy who can get you anything you need, anything. If you want to teach her a lesson, he's your man. John knew he should walk away. He knew that nothing good could come from this conversation. But the alcohol clouding his judgment, combined with the raw pain of betrayal, silenced the rational part of his brain. Tell me more, he heard himself say. An hour later, John stumbled out of the bar, a small vial tucked safely in his pocket. The stranger's words echoed in his head. Just a few drops will do it. It'll hurt like hell, but it won't kill her. She'll have to live with the scars, just like you'll have to live with what she did to you. As John made his way back to their apartment, a part of him was screaming to throw the vial away, to turn back from this dark path he was on. But that voice was drowned out by the roar of his pain and anger. In his alcohol-addled mind, this seemed like justice. Linda had scarred him emotionally. Now she would bear physical scars to match. Across town, Linda was frantic with worry. Hours had passed with no word from John. Her calls went straight to voicemail, her texts unanswered. She had called his friends, his family, even his workplace, but no one had seen or heard from him. As night fell, Linda found herself sitting on the couch, staring at the engagement ring on her finger. The diamond that had sparkled so brightly yesterday now seemed dull, a painful reminder of how quickly happiness could turn to ashes. The sound of a key in the lock made her jump. Relief flooded through her as John stumbled into the apartment. But that relief quickly turned to apprehension as she took in his disheveled appearance and the wild look in his eyes. John, she said, rising from the couch. Thank God you're home. I've been so worried. We need to talk, to work this out. John stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on Linda with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step back. Talk? He slurred. What's there to talk about? You made your choice. No, John, you don't understand, Linda pleaded, moving towards him. I chose you. I want to be with you. What happened with Marcus was a mistake, and it's over. Liar, John roared, causing Linda to flinch. You're just saying that because you got caught. Well, I'm done being your fool, Linda. Before Linda could react, John had crossed the room, grabbing her arm roughly. You want to scar me? He growled, pulling the vial from his pocket. Well, now I'm going to scar you. Linda's eyes widened in terror as she realized what John was holding. John, no. Please, don't do this. This isn't you. But John was beyond reason. In one swift motion, he uncapped the vial and flung its contents at Linda's face. The acid hit her skin with a sickening hiss, and Linda's agonized scream shattered the night. The moment the acid left the vial, John's rage evaporated, replaced by horror at what he had done. He watched, frozen, as Linda collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching at her face as she writhed in agony. Oh God, John whispered, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. What have I done? The next few minutes were a blur. John called 911, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what had happened. He attempted to help Linda, to do something, anything to ease her pain, but she shrank away from his touch, her cries of pain mixed with sobs of betrayal. As the sound of sirens filled the air, John sank to the floor, his head in his hands. In the space of 24 hours, he had gone from proposing to the love of his life to becoming a monster who had inflicted unimaginable pain on her. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. The paramedics arrived, quickly assessing the situation and rushing Linda to the hospital. The police weren't far behind, and John offered no resistance as they placed him in handcuffs. As he was led away, he caught one last glimpse of the apartment, the shattered vial on the floor, the engagement ring glittering on the coffee table, silent witnesses to the destruction of what should have been a beautiful love story. In just 24 hours, John and Linda's lives had been irrevocably changed. Their future, which had seemed so bright and full of promise, now lay in ruins. And as the night gave way to dawn, Atlanta would wake to a story that would shock the community, a stark reminder of how quickly love could turn to hate, and how one moment of blind rage could destroy everything. The harsh fluorescent lights of Grady Memorial Hospital's emergency room cast an unforgiving glare on the chaos unfolding within. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, their voices a cacophony of medical jargon and urgent instructions. At the center of this storm lay Linda, her face covered in bandages, her body racked with pain that even the strongest painkillers couldn't fully dull. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead plastic surgeon on call that night, stood at Linda's bedside, her face grim as she assessed the extent of the damage. Miss Williams, she said softly, I know you're in a lot of pain right now with that, but I need to explain what we're dealing with. Linda nodded weakly, her throat raw from screaming. Dr. Chen continued, her voice gentle but direct. The acid has caused severe burns to the left side of your face and neck. We're doing everything we can to minimize the damage, but I have to be honest with you. There will be scarring. The extent of it won't be clear for some time, but you're looking at multiple surgeries and a long recovery process. As the doctor's words sank in, Linda felt a fresh wave of despair wash over her. She thought about her career, her dreams, the life she had planned with John. All of it now seemed impossibly out of reach. Will I? She croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. Will I ever look the same again? Dr. Chen's hesitation before answering was all the response Linda needed. She turned her head away, tears seeping into her bandages. The physical pain was excruciating, but it paled in comparison to the emotional anguish that threatened to consume her. Meanwhile, across town at the Atlanta Police Department, John sat in an interrogation room. His head bowed, his wrists chafed from the handcuffs. Detective Marcus Rollins, a veteran of the force with 20 years under his belt, sat across from him, his expression a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Let me get this straight, Rollins said, his voice hard. You proposed to this woman yesterday, and today you threw acid in her face. What the hell kind of monster does something like that? John flinched at the word monster, but he couldn't deny the truth of it. I don't know what came over me, he mumbled, unable to meet the detective's eyes. When I found out about her and Marcus, I lost control. Lost control? Rollins scoffed. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment thing, Steve. You went out, got the acid, came back home, and did this. That's premeditated. You lost control? Rollins scoffed. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment thing, Steve. You went out, got the acid, came back home, and did this. That's premeditated. You're looking at a serious time for this. John's shoulders slumped even further. The reality of his actions was starting to sink in, cutting through the haze of alcohol and anger that had clouded his judgment. I never meant to. I didn't think. That's right, you didn't think. Rollins cut him off. You didn't think about the pain you'd cause, the lives you'd ruin, not just hers, but yours too. Hope it was worth it. As John was led back to his cell, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought about Linda, about the pain she must be in, both physical and emotional. He thought about their families, their friends, how this one moment of madness would ripple out and affect so many lives. And for what? Revenge? Jealousy? It all seemed so pointless now. Back at the hospital, Linda's room had become a hub of activity. Her parents had arrived, their faces etched with worry and barely contained anger. Her mother, Evelyn, sat by her bedside, gently stroking the uninjured parts of her arm, while her father, Robert, paced the room, alternating between comforting his daughter and demanding updates from the medical staff. "Baby, we're here for you," Evelyn murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "We're going to get through this together." Linda tried to respond, but the pain made it difficult to speak. Instead, she squeezed her mother's hand weakly, drawing what comfort she could from the familiar touch. Robert paused in his pacing, turning to face his daughter. "I swear, Linda, that monster is going to pay for what he's done. I'll make sure he rots in jail for this." Linda wanted to tell him that vengeance wouldn't undo what had been done, that it wouldn't erase her scars or take away her pain. But she didn't have the strength for that conversation. Instead, she closed her eyes, letting the medication pull her into a fitful sleep. As news of the attack spread, it sent shockwaves through Atlanta's community. Local news stations ran breaking reports, their anchors struggling to maintain composure as they relayed the horrific details. Social media exploded with messages of support for Linda and condemnation for John. At the coffee shop where Linda had met Marcus earlier that day, the staff and regulars gathered in stunned silence, watching the news unfold on the small TV above the counter. Marcus himself sat in a corner booth, his head in his hands, racked with guilt. If he hadn't pursued Linda, if he hadn't asked to meet her that day, would any of this have happened? As the night wore on, the city seemed to hold its collective breath. In hospital rooms, police stations, and homes across Atlanta, people grappled with the shocking turn of events. A love story that had seemed so perfect just 24 hours ago had transformed into a nightmare, leaving everyone to wonder, how could this happen? How could love turn to hate so quickly? And in the wake of such violence, was there any hope for healing? The answers to these questions would unfold in the days, weeks, and months to come. As Linda fought to recover, John faced the consequences of his actions, and a community struggled to make sense of a senseless act of violence. The scars, both visible and invisible, would serve as a constant reminder of how quickly life can change and of the devastating power of unchecked emotions. As dawn broke over Atlanta, casting a soft light on the city's skyline, it marked not just the start of a new day, but the beginning of a long and painful journey for all involved. The story of Linda and John, once a tale of love and promise, had become a cautionary tale. A stark reminder of the thin line between love and hate and the irreversible consequences of crossing it. In the weeks following the attack, Linda's world narrowed to the confines of her hospital room. The days blurred together in a haze of pain, medication, and endless medical procedures. Dr. Chen and her team worked tirelessly, performing multiple surgeries to minimize the damage caused by the acid. Each operation brought with it a mix of hope and fear. Hope that this time the results would be better, and fear of what Linda would see when the bandages come off. Linda's parents had practically moved into the hospital, taking turns sitting by her bedside, offering whatever comfort they could. Friends and colleagues sent a steady stream of flowers, cards, and well wishes, but Linda found it hard to take solace in these gestures. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw John's face contorted with rage. felt the burning sensation of the acid on her skin. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was the emotional trauma that threatened to break her. One particularly difficult day, about a month after the attack, Linda lay in her bed, staring out the window at the Atlanta skyline. Dr. Chen had just left after changing her bandages and discussing the progress of her healing. The news wasn't bad exactly, but it wasn't what Linda had hoped for either. "The healing is progressing as well as can be expected," Dr. Chen had said, her voice gentle but matter of fact. "But I want you to understand, Linda, while we can improve the appearance of the scars, they will always be visible to some degree." Those words echoed in Linda's mind now, bringing with them a fresh wave of despair. She thought about her life before, her successful career, her active social life, the ease with which she had moved through the world. Would any of that be possible now? Would people ever be able to look at her without pity or revulsion? A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice still raspy from the damage to her throat. To her surprise, it was Marcus who entered, looking hesitant and carrying a small potted orchid. "Hey, Linda," he said softly. "I hope it's okay that I'm here. I need to see you to apologize." Linda felt a complex mix of emotions at the sight of him. Anger, sadness, a hint of the affection she had once felt. "Apologize for what, Marcus? You're not the one who did this to me." Marcus set the orchid down and took a seat beside her bed, his eyes filled with guilt. "No, but I feel responsible. If I hadn't pursued you, if I hadn't asked to meet that day." "Stop," Linda cut him off. "What John did? That's on him. Not you, not me. Him." She was surprised by the strength in her own voice, the conviction she felt in those words. It was the first time since the attack that she had felt anything close to anger towards John, rather than fear or sadness. Marcus nodded, looking relieved but still troubled. "How are you doing? Really?" Linda was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I'm surviving," she finally said. "Some days are harder than others, but I'm here. I'm alive. I have to believe that counts for something." They talked for a while longer, the conversation gradually becoming easier. Marcus filled her in on what was happening at work, shared funny stories about their colleagues, did his best to connect her to the world outside her hospital room. By the time he left, Linda felt something she hadn't in weeks, a glimmer of hope. That evening, as she prepared for yet another night in the hospital, Linda made a decision. She couldn't change what had happened to her, couldn't erase the scars that now marked her face and body, but she could choose how to move forward. She could let this experience break her, or she could use it to become stronger. With trembling hands, she reached for the small mirror on her bedside table. Taking a deep breath, she raised it to her face, forcing herself to really look at her reflection for the first time since the attack. The scars were angry and red, twisting across the left side of her face and down her neck. They were shocking, yes, but as she continued to look, Linda saw something else too. She saw strength. She saw survival. "This is me now," she whispered to her reflection, "and I'm still here." It wasn't an epiphany that magically made everything better. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, filled with more surgeries, therapy sessions, and moments of doubt. But it was a start, a small step towards reclaiming her life. As Linda drifted off to sleep that night, she felt a sense of resolve settling over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was going to face it head-on, scars and all. Across town, in a stark prison cell, John too was grappling with the consequences of his actions. The initial shock and alcohol-induced haze had long since worn off, leaving him to face the full horror of what he had done. Every night, he relived the moment he threw the acid, heard Linda's screams, saw the pain and betrayal in her eyes. The guilt was a constant, gnawing presence, threatening to consume him. John had been denied bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to the community. His days were now spent in a monotonous routine of meals, exercise periods, and long hours alone with his thoughts. His family had distanced themselves, shocked and disgusted by his actions. His friends had disappeared, unwilling to be associated with someone capable of such violence. In the quiet of his cell, John thought about the future he had thrown away. He thought about Linda, about the pain he had caused her, the scars she would carry for the rest of her life. He thought about his own life, forever altered by one moment of blind rage. As the gravity of his situation settled in, John made a decision of his own. He couldn't undo what he had done, couldn't take away Linda's pain or erase her scars. But he could take responsibility for his actions. He could use whatever time he had left to try to become a better person, to understand and address the anger and insecurity that had led him to this point. The next morning, John asked to speak with his lawyer. When the attorney arrived, John's request was simple. I want to plead guilty. I don't want to drag this out in court to make Linda relive what I did to her. I'll take whatever sentence they give me. It was a small gesture, perhaps, in the face of the enormous harm he had caused, but it was a start, a first step on his own long road towards redemption. As the sun set over Atlanta that evening, casting long shadows across the city, two lives forever intertwined by violence were taking their first tentative steps towards healing. In a hospital room and a prison cell, Linda and John were each facing the consequences of that fateful night, each beginning the slow, painful process of rebuilding their lives from the ashes of what once was. The story of Linda and John had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the destructive power of jealousy and rage. But perhaps in time, it could also become a story of resilience, of the human capacity to heal and grow even in the face of unimaginable pain. Only time would tell. The Atlanta courthouse stood imposing against the clear blue sky, its neoclassical facade a silent witness to countless stories of justice and injustice over the years. Today, it would bear witness to another such story, one that had captured the attention of the entire city. Linda Williams sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Despite the numerous surgeries and treatments she had undergone in the months since the attack, the scars were still visible, a permanent reminder of that horrific night. But there was a strength in her posture, a determination in her eyes that spoke of the inner healing she had achieved. Beside her sat her parents, their faces a mixture of worry and pride. Behind them, the courtroom was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and supporters who had been following Linda's story. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. When John Steve was led into the courtroom, a hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. He looked a shadow of his former self, thinner, paler, his once confident stride now hesitant and unsure. As he passed the gallery, his eyes met Linda's for a brief moment. In that fleeting glance, a world of regret, pain, and unspoken words passed between them. The proceedings began, the familiar rituals of the court playing out with solemn efficiency. When it came time for John to enter his plea, he stood, his voice barely audible as he said, "Guilty, Your Honor." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Despite John's earlier decision to plead guilty, many had expected a last-minute change, a plea bargain, anything but this full admission of guilt. The judge, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, looked down at John over her glasses. "Mr. Steve, you understand that by pleading guilty to aggravated battery with intent to disfigure, you face a sentence of up to 50 years in prison?" John nodded, his voice stronger this time. "I do, Your Honor, and I accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate. What I did, there's no excuse for it. I can't undo it, but I can accept the consequences." The judge then turned to Linda. "Miss Williams, as the victim in this case, you have the right to make a statement if you wish." Linda took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had thought long and hard about what she would say at this moment. Slowly, she stood and made her way to the front of the courtroom. As she turned to face the gallery, she removed her hat, revealing her scars to the world for the first time in public. A hush fell over the courtroom as Linda began to speak, her voice soft but unwavering. "What happened to me that night was horrific. The pain, both physical and emotional, was beyond anything I could have imagined. For a long time, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see a future beyond the scars, beyond the trauma." She paused, her eyes scanning the room before settling on John. "But I'm still here. I'm still Linda Williams. These scars are part of me now, but they don't define me. What John did was unforgivable, but I refuse to let it destroy me. I choose to move forward, to live my life to the fullest." Turning back to the judge, Linda continued, "I don't seek vengeance. What I want is justice. Not just for me, but for anyone who might suffer a similar fate. I want the sentence to reflect the severity of the crime, but also to allow for the possibility of rehabilitation. Because if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that healing is possible, even in the darkest of circumstances. As Linda returned to her seat, the courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, and even the most hardened journalists found themselves moved by her words. The sentencing came swiftly, taking into account John's guilty plea and genuine remorse, but also the premeditated nature of the crime and its devastating consequences. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As John was led away, he turned one last time to Linda. "I'm sorry," he mouthed, tears streaming down his face. Linda nodded, acknowledging his words but offering no forgiveness. Some wounds were too deep, some actions too heinous to ever be truly forgiven. Outside the courthouse, Linda faced a sea of reporters and cameras. With her head held high, she addressed the media. "Today marks the end of a chapter, but not the end of my story. I choose to focus not on what was taken from me, but on what I still have: my life, my loved ones, my strength. To anyone out there who's suffering, who feels like they can't go on, I want you to know that you're not alone. There is hope, there is healing, and there is life after trauma." As Linda's words were broadcast across Atlanta and beyond, they resonated with countless individuals who had faced their own battles, their own scars. Her story became a beacon of hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the months and years that followed, Linda threw herself into advocacy work, using her experience to push for stricter laws against acid attacks and better support for survivors. She became a sought-after motivational speaker, her scars a visible reminder of her journey from victim to survivor to thriver. John, for his part, dedicated himself to rehabilitation programs in prison. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could work to understand the root of his actions and strive to become a better person. Whether that would ever be enough remained to be seen. The story of Linda and John, which had begun with love and ended in violence, had transformed into something else entirely. A powerful narrative about the consequences of unchecked emotions, the long road to healing, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. As the sun set on Atlanta that evening, casting a warm glow over the city, it illuminated a community forever changed by one couple's tragic story. But in that golden light, there was also a glimmer of hope. Hope for healing, for growth, and for a future where love didn't turn to hate, where momentary anger didn't lead to lifelong scars. The tale of Linda and John would be told and retold, a cautionary story and an inspirational one, reminding all who heard it of the power of choices, the weight of consequences, and the enduring strength of the human heart. The Atlanta skyline glowed in the soft light of dawn, the city slowly coming to life as the sun peeked over the horizon. In a cozy apartment overlooking Piedmont Park, Linda Williams stood at the window, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, watching the world wake up. 5 years had passed since that fateful night that had changed her life forever. The scars on her face and neck had faded somewhat with time and numerous treatments, but they were still visible, a permanent reminder of how quickly life could change. But Linda no longer hid from her reflection. She had learned to see beauty in her scars, strength in her survival. Her phone buzzed with a notification, reminding her of the day's schedule. In just a few hours, she would be speaking at a conference for survivors of violent crimes. Her story, which had once been splashed across news headlines as a sensational tragedy, had become a source of inspiration for many. Linda had found her voice, using her experience to advocate for stricter laws against acid attacks and better support systems for survivors. As she prepared for her day, Linda's thoughts drifted to John. She had heard through her lawyer that he was doing well in prison, fully committed to rehabilitation programs and even mentoring younger inmates. The news had stirred complex emotions in her, a mix of residual anger, a tinge of sadness for what could have been, and a cautious hope that perhaps some good could come from their tragic story. Across town, in the state penitentiary, John Steve sat on the edge of his bunk, a well-worn notebook in his hands. The pages were filled with his thoughts, reflections, and the hard-earned insights of a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. Today marked 5 years since he had made the worst decision of his life. 5 years since he had let jealousy and rage destroy not just his life, but Linda's as well. Prison had been a harsh teacher, but John had embraced the lessons. He had delved deep into therapy, confronting the insecurities and anger issues that had led him to that point. He had educated himself, earning a degree in psychology with a focus on anger management and rehabilitation. And he had made a vow to dedicate whatever remained of his life to preventing others from making the same terrible mistakes he had. As the morning count began, John closed his notebook and stood, ready to face another day. He knew that no amount of good behavior or self-improvement could ever undo the harm he had caused, but he was determined to try anyway. It was the least he could do, the only way he could think, to honor Linda's strength and resilience. Back in her apartment, Linda put the finishing touches on her makeup, a routine that had once been a source of anxiety, but now felt almost meditative. She had long since stopped trying to cover her scars completely, instead opting for a natural look that embraced her changed appearance. As she grabbed her keys and headed out the door, Linda paused for a moment, her hand resting on the doorknob. 5 years ago, she had left this same apartment with no idea of the horror that awaited her. The Linda who had walked out that door was gone, transformed by pain and trauma, but also by healing and growth. The Linda who stood there now was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. She had learned the hard way that life could change in an instant, that love could turn to hate, that trust could be shattered. But she had also learned that healing was possible, that strength could be found in the darkest of places, and that one's scars, both physical and emotional, could become a source of power rather than shame. As Linda stepped out into the bright Atlanta morning, she felt a sense of purpose and hope. Her story, born from tragedy, had become a beacon of resilience and healing for others. And while she could never forget the events that had brought her to this point, she was no longer defined by them. The city bustled around her, full of people going about their day, each carrying their own stories of love, loss, and everything in between. And in that moment, Linda felt profoundly connected to it all, to the pain and the joy, the struggles and the triumphs that made up the tapestry of human experience. She had survived, she had healed, and now she was thriving. And as she made her way to the conference, ready to share her story once again, Linda knew that every word she spoke, every scar she bore, was a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The story of Linda and John, a tale of love turned to violence, of scars both visible and invisible, had become so much more than a cautionary tale. It had become a story of transformation, of the long and difficult journey from victim to survivor to advocate. And in that transformation lay a powerful message of hope, that even from the darkest of experiences, light could emerge, that healing was possible, and that one's deepest wounds could become one's greatest strength. As the Atlanta sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the city in golden light, it shone on a woman who had been broken but had pieced herself back together, stronger at the mended places. Linda Williams walked with purpose, her scars a map of where she had been, her eyes fixed firmly on where she was going. Her story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And so, the tale that began with a proposal and spiraled into tragedy had found its way to a new chapter, one of resilience, growth, and the enduring power of the human spirit to rise above even the deepest pain. In the end, it was a reminder to all who heard it that while we cannot always choose what happens to us, we can always choose how we respond, how we heal, and how we move forward. In the tapestry of human experience, Linda and John's story had become a thread, dark in places but also shot through with glimmers of hope, redemption, and the transformative power of survival. And as long as their story continued to be told, it would serve as a powerful reminder of the strength that can be found in healing, the wisdom that can be gained from pain, and the light that can emerge even from the darkest of nights.